A single envelope waited on the Pope's desk, untouched, as if opening it might unmake the day. Outside, Rome moved carefully, like a city afraid to wake the one man whose decision could change its soul. By nightfall, that letter would not only separate a pope and his closest cardinal, it would open the door to signs no one in the Vatican could explain. Morning crept into the apostolic palace in thin, cautious strokes. It slid across the polished tiles of the papal study, climbed the legs of a wooden desk, and came to rest against the white sleeve of Pope Leo XIV. He sat in his chair like a man holding his breath. A worn breviary lay open in his hands, its pages softened by years of prayer, the margins faintly darkened by the oil of his fingertips. His eyes moved, but his mind didn't follow. The words on the page were familiar, the weight on the desk in front of him was not. The envelope rested there between a brass crucifix and a stack of documents that suddenly felt unimportant. Petro had placed it there just before dawn, bowing his head and withdrawing without a sound. Leo hadn't asked where it came from. He didn't need to. Some knowledge doesn't arrive in words. It arrives as an ache, quiet, heavy, unmistakable, sitting behind the breastbone like a stone. For days that ache had been growing, and now it had a shape, sealed in wax and paper, addressed not to the office of the papacy, but to the man who carried it. He let his gaze drift to the window. Rome was waking, but cautiously. The bells of a nearby church rang once, hesitated, and fell silent, as if thinking better of announcing the hour too loudly. In the courtyards below, the usual rhythm of footsteps had softened. Guards spoke in low tones. Even the pigeons perched along the colonnade seemed less sure of themselves, hopping in short, tentative bursts before settling to watch. The city did not know it was witnessing the beginning of a farewell. And yet in the way the light lingered on the dome of St. Peter's, in the thin chill of the air, there was a sense, hard to name, impossible to shake, that some invisible line was about to be crossed. Leo lowered his eyes back to the envelope. His thumb traced the edge of the seal, feeling its slight ridge through the paper. He hadn't opened it, but the contents were already written in his heart. Not verbatim, not phrase by phrase, but in essence, a burden relinquished, a duty surrendered, a love that chose to step away rather than weigh him down. Lewis. He didn't need to see the signature to know. For 2 decades, Cardinal Tagle had walked at his side, through synods that frayed tempers, through late-night strategy over bitter coffee, through crises that threatened to split the church along unseen fault lines. They had disagreed often and fiercely, but never as enemies. If anything, their arguments had been the sharpest proof of their bond. Between them there had never been rivalry, only the strange fraternity of 2 men who loved the same God and feared failing him in different ways. Leo drew a slow breath. "You took your time," he murmured to the letter, half in prayer, half in resignation. "But I suppose you were always coming." A soft sound at the door pulled him from his thoughts. The handle turned without a knock. Tagle had not knocked in years. There are friendships that simply step through the doorway. He entered quietly, the red of his cassock catching the early light, his face carrying the exhaustion of a man who had walked too long with something unsaid. Leo closed the breviary and offered a faint, familiar smile. "You're early," he said. "You usually let the bells finish before you steal my morning." Tagle attempted a smile in return, but it faltered before it reached his eyes. "I didn't sleep," he admitted. His voice had the worn edge of a pilgrim who has reached a gate and is no longer sure he's meant to go through. "Your Holiness." "Leo," the Pope interrupted softly. "Just Leo. At least for today." The title dropped away, and with it, a layer of distance neither of them wanted. Silence spread between them, not empty, not hostile, but dense, full of all the conversations they had avoided in the last few weeks. The silence of two men who already know the outcome and are still trying to find a gentler path to reach it. Tagle crossed the room. He did not stop at the measured distance custom demanded. He walked all the way to the desk and went down on one knee. Not in the formal posture of obedience, but in something older, simpler, harder, friendship. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the envelope and set it directly in front of Leo. "I wrote this," he said. "And every time I look at it, I wonder if I should ask you to throw it away." Leo studied his face, the deeper lines at the corners of his eyes, the tiredness in his shoulders, the trace of peace fighting its way through the sorrow. "If you are afraid of the words," Leo replied quietly, "we can face them together. As we've done with everything else." He slipped a finger beneath the seal. The wax cracked with a small, final sigh. The parchment unfolded, hesitant but inevitable. The handwriting inside was Tagle's, steady, unadorned, the script of a man who had never used beauty as a disguise. Leo began to read. "Most Holy Father, forgive me. The path we began together now asks that I step aside. The work I once bore with joy has become too heavy for the strength I have left. I have seen what you carry, and I cannot, in love, add another stone to your cross." The words were simple. No theology, no politics, just a confession of limits, a man admitting that love sometimes means walking away so another can stand. Tagle kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Leo let the letter drop gently to the desk and exhaled, a quiet, shuddering breath that seemed to release years of unspoken fear. "You are not abandoning your post," Leo said at last. "You are obeying something that has come to you before it has come to me." He did not yet know how literal that would become. He did not know that, in the days ahead, Tagle's journal would begin writing again from far beyond Rome. That the rosary he would hand his friend at their parting would later appear, inexplicably, in a locked Vatican chapel. That candles would burn against wind, that letters would arrive without couriers, that in the quietest hours, a familiar voice would speak where no man stood. For now there was only the study, the kneeling cardinal, the letter between them, and a city holding its breath just beyond the walls. It was the last moment before the silence started to speak, before resignation, obedience, and grief would open into visions, signs, and a bridge of light over the Tiber that would turn this goodbye into something Rome would remember as a miracle. Quick moment, subscribe now. It helps the channel grow and guarantees you never miss the next release. Morning slipped into the apostolic palace like a secret. It moved in thin, hesitant bands across the polished tiles, climbed the carved legs of a wooden desk, and came to rest on the folded hands of Pope Leo XIV. He sat in his study as he always did at that hour, in the high-backed chair that had learned the weight of his shoulders. A worn breviary lay open before him, Latin lines flowing down the page like a river he knew by heart. The corners of the book had long since softened, the leather carried the faint sheen of decades of fingers turning pages in the dark. He was not reading. His eyes passed over the words, but his mind circled something else, the single, small shape that broke the order of his desk. An envelope. It lay between a brass crucifix and a neat stack of briefs, its white surface almost luminous in the early light. It had arrived just before dawn, delivered by Monsignor Petro, who had stepped in, bowed silently, and withdrawn with the quiet efficiency of a man who has served one pontificate so long that he himself had become part of its furniture. Leo had watched him place it there. He had not asked from whom it came. He had not needed to. Some truths do not arrive by surprise. They gather like clouds on the horizon, slow and steady, visible long before the first drop of rain. For weeks, perhaps months, the sky around this moment had been darkening inside Leo's chest. Now the storm had taken shape in paper and wax. He let his thumb rest lightly on the edge of the envelope, feeling the firmness of the seal beneath the softness of the fibers. A dull ache pushed up behind his ribs, not fear, not quite sorrow, but the heavy recognition that something long delayed could no longer be postponed. Outside, Rome was waking, but not with its usual confidence. The bells of Santa Anna rang once, twice, and then seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to summon the full day. Their echo faded quickly in the cool air. In the courtyards below, the scatter of footsteps was muted. Clergy and guards moved in shorter lines, their conversations clipped and quiet. Even the pigeons that normally strutted across the balustrades in noisy flurries now shifted in place, wings tucked, heads turning, as though listening for something they could not name. The city did not know what lay inside the letter on the Pope's desk. But in the thinness of the morning light, in the strangely subdued air, there was a sense that Rome itself was holding its breath. Leo exhaled slowly and turned his gaze back to the envelope. He already knew the shape of the handwriting inside. He could see it in his mind, careful, unhurried, with the barest curve at the end of each line, the way a man's script changes when every stroke of the pen is preceded by a prayer. Lewis. Cardinal Tagle. The knowledge was not a guess, it was the natural end of a path he had been walking alongside that man for 20 years. 2 decades of shared labor unrolled in Leo's memory like a film. Late-night arguments over doctrine that stretched until the bells of Lord's cut them short. Quiet laughter over cups of coffee so strong it seemed brewed for battle. Silent walks through the gardens after scandals that left both men wondering if the church they loved could survive the weight of its own sins. They had disagreed often, sometimes fiercely. Lewis's instinct for mercy had collided again and again with Leo's fear of compromise. But their clashes had never grown into rivalry. If anything, each conflict had tasted of a strange, chastening tenderness, 2 men sharpening one another in the shadow of the same cross. Between them there had been no politics, no calculated distance. Only the particular fraternity of men who pray for each other more than they speak about it. Leo's fingers tightened slightly around the breviary. "I wondered how long you would fight yourself," he murmured under his breath, eye still on the envelope. "Longer than most men, Lewis. Longer than me." The latch on the door clicked softly. There were men in the Vatican who rehearsed every movement before entering the papal study, the angle of their bow, the exact phrasing of their greeting, the position of their hands. Tagle was not one of them. He had not knocked in years. Some relationships no longer needed the permission of wood and metal. He stepped inside, red-watered silk catching a slant of morning light. Leo closed the breviary gently and looked up. "You're early," he said, and there was affection in the simple observation. "You usually let the bells finish before you steal my morning." Tagle tried to smile. It reached his mouth, but not his eyes. "I couldn't sleep," he replied. His voice was lower than usual, the words moving slowly, as if each had to be pulled up from a deep well. "Your Holiness." "Leo," the Pope interrupted, raising a hand almost apologetically. "Just Leo. For today." The title fell away, and the atmosphere shifted with it. The study stopped being an audience chamber and became, once more, a room where two men had once stayed up all night wrestling questions no encyclical could fully answer. Silence settled between them. Not the smooth, polished silence of ceremony, but a rough, human pause, thick with all the thoughts both had carried but not spoken. Tagle's gaze dropped to the envelope on the desk. He crossed the room in measured steps, his hands clasped lightly before him. He did not stop at the prescribed distance, he kept walking until he stood just on the other side of the desk, close enough that Leo could see the faint tremor in his fingers. Without a word, he went down on one knee. He had knelt for Leo 1,000 times in public, but this was different. This was not the stylized descent of ritual obedience. This was a man lowering himself in front of a friend because there was no other way to stay upright. Tagle picked up the envelope, held it for a moment as if feeling its weight anew, then set it carefully in the center of the blotter. "I wrote this," he said quietly. "Every night I told myself I would give it to you in the morning. Every morning I told myself I would wait one more day." Leo watched his face as he spoke, the deepening lines around his eyes, the gray threading more boldly through his hair, the mixture of weariness and relief struggling for dominance in his expression. "Why today?" Leo asked, not as a superior, but as a man who already knew the answer and needed to hear it aloud. Tagle swallowed, then lifted his eyes. "Because love," he said, "has begun to feel like disobedience." The sentence hung in the air like incense. Leo's heart clenched. "If you fear the words," he said gently, "we can face them together." He reached for the envelope. The wax gave way with a small, resigned crack. The parchment unfolded, its rustle startlingly loud in the quiet room. The script inside was instantly familiar, Tagle's steady hand, each letter clear, the ink neither rushed nor flourished. Leo began to read, letting his voice carry the lines that Lewis had written alone. "Most Holy Father, forgive me. The path we began together now asks that I step aside. The burden I once carried with joy has become too heavy for faith alone. I have seen what you carry, and I can no longer add weight to your cross. If obedience means remaining, I fear I will fail you. If obedience means letting go, then I must trust that God will hold what we cannot." The words were clean, unadorned. There was no anger in them, no hidden accusation. Only an honest confession of limits and a willingness to suffer the consequences of naming them. Leo finished the letter and let the page fall closed against the desk. For a moment, neither man moved. Tagle kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Leo stared at the edge of the parchment, at the neat curve of the final line where the pen had lifted. The room felt smaller than it had before, the walls closer, the ceiling somehow lower, as if the entire palace were bending inward around the weight of that simple surrender. "I remember," Leo said slowly, "the first time you came to this office. You told me obedience was the only thing in your life you were sure you could give completely." A faint, sad smile touched Tagle's mouth. "I was younger then," he answered. I did not yet know that obedience sometimes asks you to break your own heart. Leo rose from his chair. The movement was unhurried. The Pope was not a man who rushed, especially not in the presence of suffering. He walked around the desk until he stood directly in front of Tagle, who still knelt on the polished floor, red robes pooling around him like spilled wine. Gently, Leo laid a hand on his shoulder. Louis looked up. In his eyes Leo saw exhaustion, yes, but also something else. A kind of nakedness. The look of a man who has brought his last secret into the light and has nothing left to hide behind. The burden you once carried with joy, Leo said, echoing the line from the letter, has not become too heavy for faith. It has become too heavy for one man. There is a difference. Tagle's throat worked. I thought staying was the braver choice, he whispered. Now I am afraid that staying would be pride, not courage. Leo squeezed his shoulder gently. Then perhaps, he said, letting go is your obedience. And accepting that letting go is obedience, perhaps that is mine. The words scraped against his own heart as he spoke them, but they were true. He had seen the signs of strain in Louis long before this letter. The long pauses before answers. The way his hands lingered a little too long on the back of a pew after long meetings, as if he needed help standing that he refused to ask for. You are not abandoning me, Leo said, his voice softer now. You are trusting that God can hold both of us when we are no longer standing side by side. Tagle bowed his head, and for a moment it seemed he might break. But he didn't. The tears that rimmed his eyes did not fall. They hung there unshed, like prayers that had not yet found words. Will you forgive me? He asked at last. Leo did not hesitate. There is nothing to forgive, he answered. Only something to accept. He drew the cardinal to his feet and into a brief, rough embrace that felt more like two men keeping each other from collapsing than any ceremonial gesture. When they stepped apart, the letter still lay open on the desk, the ink gleaming faintly in the strengthening light. Outside, the bells began again, this time ringing the full hour, their sound rolling over roofs and courtyards, carrying into the narrow streets where Rome was finally, fully awake. Inside the study, Pope and Cardinal stood facing one another across 20 years of brotherhood and a single sheet of paper that would change everything. Leo picked up the letter one last time, read the opening line silently, and then set it down with care, as if placing a fragile relic into a reliquary. He felt the shift inside his chest, the subtle but irrevocable movement from before to after. His lips moved in a whisper, almost lost beneath the distant bells, meant for no one but God and the man standing in front of him. So, he said, it begins. The bells were still fading when Tagle left. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded, to Leo, far louder than it should have. The study felt abruptly larger, as if the space that had once been occupied by another man's presence had emptied all at once, leaving the furniture and walls uncertain of their purpose. Leo stood alone for a moment, his hand resting on the edge of the desk, eyes on the letter that now defined everything. So, it begins, he had whispered. The beginning did not take long to show itself. By mid-morning, the Vatican had learned to walk more quietly. The decision had not yet been announced, but rumors moved through marble faster than sound. A single overheard sentence in the secretariat. A glance between two monsignors in a corridor. A courier leaving the apostolic palace with eyes too wide and lips pressed too tight. It did not take much. By the time the sun had climbed above the dome of St. Peter's, journalists were already gathering at the press office gates. Cameras hung from their shoulders like weapons waiting to be drawn. Some spoke into phones, others into microphones, their voices layered over one another in a dozen languages, all asking the same question without yet knowing how to phrase it. Inside, the Curia whispered. Cardinals who normally strode through hallways with easy, measured authority now walked in pairs or small clusters, their red-watered silk a moving field of unspoken anxiety. Doors closed a little more firmly. Conversations broke off when footsteps approached. The word resignation floated through the air like a draft, felt more than seen, chilling the skin. Rome sensed it. Not in facts, those would come later, but in the way the day itself seemed off balance. Taxi drivers who serviced the Borgo exchanged half-formed speculations with each other at stoplights. Pilgrims in the square looked up at the papal apartment with the wary curiosity of people who suspect history is shifting above their heads but cannot yet see how. If anyone had asked Leo about it, he would have agreed that upheaval was underway. He would also have insisted that the real storm was not outside. He walked the corridors of the apostolic palace like a man moving through fog. Petro kept pace beside him, a discreet step behind, holding a stack of documents that suddenly felt obscene in their normalcy. Drafts of homilies. Briefings on diocesan issues. Reports from commissions that now seemed to belong to a different life. Your Holiness, the Secretariat has requested, Petro began. Later, Leo said gently, not slowing his stride. They passed portraits of popes long gone, their painted eyes watching from gilded frames. Some had reigned briefly, some for decades. All had made decisions that altered the course of souls and nations. Leo had always found comfort in their silent company, a reminder that his burdens were not unique. Today their faces seemed to recede into the canvas, unreachable. His mind kept returning to the study, to the sound of the wax cracking, to the sight of Tagle on his knees, to the feel of the red cloth beneath his hands when they had embraced. Memories he had thought would remain diffuse for years had suddenly sharpened, as if the knowledge of an ending had thrown every shared moment into harsher light. He saw Tagle as he had been in the early days, young, fierce, laughing too loudly over coffee at first light. Then in the middle years, his voice tempered, his sermons quieter but deeper. And finally in recent months, his shoulders slumped just a fraction more, his eyes lingering on the tabernacle for an extra heartbeat after Mass. You are somewhere in this building still, Leo thought, as he turned a corner and passed a window overlooking the inner garden. And already, I miss you as if you were on the other side of the world. By afternoon, the necessary machinery of the church demanded his attention. Drafts of the official communiqué were presented, polished, revised. Phrases were weighed and reweighted, for reasons of health, after prayerful discernment, with the Holy Father's acceptance. Leo signed the final version with a hand that did not tremble, though he half expected it to. When the sun began its descent, the press office released the brief statement. Screens in newsrooms lit up. Phones buzzed. Broadcasters straightened their jackets and announced that Cardinal Tagle had tendered his resignation from his post in the Curia, accepted by Pope Leo XIV. Some spoke of strategy, others of factions. A few, who had watched them together for years, spoke of a sadness they could not quite explain. Leo heard none of it. By then, he had retreated to his private rooms, the public part of the day finally giving way to the quiet he had been both longing for and dreading. Night wrapped itself around the apostolic palace. The corridors emptied. Lights dimmed. The Vatican settled into the peculiar hush that comes when the business of the Church pauses but never quite sleeps. Leo sat once more at his desk. The letter lay before him again, now with a few additional ink marks, a date, a notation for the archives. The paper already seemed older, as if time had accelerated around it. "I should send you to the secret archives," he said softly, addressing the letter. "Let you disappear into a box and become a line in a catalogue." He did not reach for it. Instead, his eyes moved to the shelf behind him, where a row of leather-bound volumes stood in obedient line, personal journals, correspondences, small relics of a life measured in pages. One spine was missing. He turned slowly. Tagle's journal, the one Lewis had entrusted to him years ago when a health scare had briefly threatened his memory, had been sent to the archives months earlier at Leo's insistence. "The Cardinal had wanted it kept safe in case my mind forgets what my soul has seen." Leo had agreed and watched Petro carry it away. It was not on the shelf now. It was on his desk. He stared at it, his breath caught midway. The journal lay to the left of the letter, closed, its dark leather cover catching the lamplight. The familiar cross drawn in the corner by Tagle's own hand was unmistakable. The ribbon marker, frayed at the end, hung at an angle Leo remembered. "Petro?" Leo called, his voice breaking the silence. The door opened almost at once, as if the secretary had been standing guard just outside. "Yes, Holy Father." Leo pointed at the journal. "Did you bring this from the archives?" Petro frowned. "No, Your Holiness. I have not been to the archives today. I thought it was still there, as you ordered." Leo's gaze moved between the man and the book. Who else would have access? "Only the archivist and his assistants," Petro said. "But none of them would place it here without your request." "I can inquire if—" "No," Leo interrupted quietly. "Leave it for now." Petro hesitated. "Shall I stay?" Leo shook his head. "Thank you, Petro. I will call if I need you." When the door closed, the room felt smaller again. Leo reached for the journal. The leather was warm, as if it had been recently held. He opened it where the ribbon rested, expecting to find the last familiar entry, that quiet reflection Tagle had written just before surrendering it, a meditation on Peter sinking beneath the waves when he looked away from Christ. Instead, he found fresh ink. The date at the top of the page was today. His heart stuttered. He read, "I have left the palace behind, but it has not left me. Every stone I step on in this city feels like a memory of obedience. I walk now as one unnamed, unseen, and yet I know his eyes are on me. Not the Pope's. Another's." Leo's grip tightened. This was Lewis's handwriting. Every curve, every angle, every spacing. But Lewis had not left yet when Leo had walked those corridors. The announcement had only just gone out. There had been no time for this entry to travel from his hand to this room. He turned the page. More lines. More ink. Sentences describing streets beyond the Vatican walls, a chapel Leo recognized from the mention of its fisherman carved in stone. Truth does not divide, one sentence read. It reveals. It cuts away what is false so that what remains may finally be seen. The words pulled at something deep inside him. He heard them again, not as ink, but as sound. Truth does not divide. It reveals. The voice was clear, familiar, close. Leo's head snapped up. The study was empty. The echo of the words led him out of the room almost before he decided to move. He walked quickly down the corridor, past Petro's surprised look, down a stairway rarely used at that hour, his feet carrying him with the unthinking certainty of habit born from years of priesthood. The chapel of the fisherman waited, small and dim, tucked away near the older wing of the palace. It had been his refuge in the early days of the pontificate, when the weight of the office had felt like a badly tailored garment. He pushed the door open. The chapel was unlit save for a single red sanctuary lamp near the tabernacle. The carved figures of Peter and Andrew in the side niches were half in shadow, their faces unreadable in the wavering glow. "Louis?" Leo said, the name leaving his lips before he could stop it. Silence. He stepped farther in, the stone floor cold through the thin soles of his slippers. Kneeling benches stretched out before him, empty. The air smelled faintly of wax and incense. Truth does not divide. It reveals. This time, the words moved through the space unmistakably. Not from his memory. Not from within. They had a place in the room, as if spoken from the sanctuary itself. Leo's pulse hammered. He turned toward the sound. Nothing. No figure, no movement, no stirring of a cassock at the edge of his vision. Only the lamp, flickering gently, and the crucifix above the altar, its wooden Christ as still as ever. He stood there for a long moment, listening to a silence that felt suspiciously full. Finally, he bowed his head. "If this is my imagination," he said quietly, "it is a cruel one. If it is not, then you must show me what you are doing." When he returned to his study, the journal still lay open on the desk. Beside it, the letter from the morning waited where he had left it. But something about it was different. Leo drew closer. The seal, which he had broken earlier in the day, seemed to bear an additional marking now, pressed faintly into the softened wax. A circle, almost complete, interrupted by a thin fracture at the top, like a ring split at a single point. He did not remember seeing it before. "Petro," he called again. The secretary entered, breath just slightly quickened from the second summons. "Yes, Holy Father." Leo pointed. "Did you notice this earlier?" Petro leaned in, squinting, then inhaled sharply. "The signum fractum," he whispered. Leo looked at him. "You know it." Petro nodded slowly. "It appears in some of the older ecclesiastical records, notations from councils, letters during times of persecution. A broken circle, used rarely, and always in connection with disruptions. Interventions believed to be not entirely human." "Miracles?" Leo asked. "Not always," Petro replied. "Sometimes warnings. Sometimes redirections. Moments when the Church's path was forced to bend by a hand it could not see." He straightened, unease clouding his features. "I have never seen it on a modern document, Holy Father." Leo dismissed him gently and sank into his chair. The journal with its impossible date. The voice in the chapel. The fractured seal on a letter that had already changed the shape of his days. He let his hands rest on the desk, palms open, as if waiting for something more to be placed there. "Louis," he said softly, though he was no longer sure to whom he was speaking, "what have you stepped into? And what, in God's name, have you drawn me into with you?" Obedience, he had always believed, was a straight road, narrow, difficult, but clear. Tonight, it felt less like a road and more like a river whose current he could not see, only feel. Was Tagle's resignation still an act of human exhaustion and love? Or had it become something else, an answer to a summons that had not originated in either of them? As the lamp on his desk burned low and the palace sank deeper into sleep, Leo stared at the fractured circle in the wax and realized, with a quiet shudder, that his greatest fear was no longer losing a friend. It was discovering that this goodbye was not merely obedience to duty, but obedience to prophecy. The dawn after the fractured seal did not feel like a new day. It felt like the continuation of a question. Leo had slept only in fragments. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the broken circle stamped into wax, the pages of Tagle's journal filling themselves with a journey that had not yet happened, the empty air in the chapel of the fisherman carrying a voice he knew too well. Petro found him at his desk again, the lamp still burning low. "Holy Father," the secretary said carefully, "there is something you should see." In the lower chapel. Leo's first thought was of the journal. "Has someone been there?" he asked. Petro hesitated. "A guard," he said. "He is disturbed. He insists the chapel was locked." He trailed off, searching for words he did not often have to use in the Vatican. And that what he saw inside was not possible. Leo rose without another question. The lower chapel was not one of the grand ones. It sat near a side entrance, used mainly by staff and guards, its simple altar and worn wooden pews bearing the wear of unremarkable devotion. 2 Swiss guards stood at the doorway now, their colorful uniforms a jarring contrast to their pale faces. The younger of the 2 looked as if he had run a long distance and not yet caught his breath. "Your Holiness," he stammered, bowing awkwardly. Leo inclined his head. "Tell me," he said. "From the beginning." "I was on the 3rd watch," the guard said, glancing nervously at the closed chapel door. "As usual, I checked the lower corridor. The chapel was locked. I remember, because I tried the handle. It did not move." "And then?" Leo prompted gently. "I walked the rest of the corridor," the guard continued. "When I came back, there was light under the door. Stronger than the sanctuary lamp. I thought perhaps someone had entered, but I had not seen or heard anyone." He swallowed. "I opened it. The lock yielded. And inside I saw." He stopped, eyes flicking to Petro and then back to Leo, as if afraid that saying it aloud would make it worse. "You saw what?" Leo asked. "A rosary," the guard said. "On the altar. Glowing." The word hung there, fragile and absurd. "Glowing?" Petro repeated slowly. The guard nodded, his hands tightening on the halberd shaft. "Like embers," he said. "Not bright enough to hurt the eyes, but alive." The beads looked lit from within, I almost fell. I dropped my lantern. When it hit the floor, the sound, it startled me. And then the light dimmed. By the time I found the courage to step closer, it was normal. But I know what I saw, Holy Father. I swear it. Leo's heartbeat had quickened with each word, though his face remained composed. Open the chapel, he said. The door swung inward. The familiar smell of wax and stone greeted them. At first glance, nothing was unusual: the plain altar, the small crucifix, the red flicker of the sanctuary lamp. And there, resting on a white corporal cloth as if deliberately placed, lay a rosary. The beads were dark, onyx, smooth, faintly reflective even in the dim light. The crucifix at the end was simple, silver-worn dull where fingers had passed over it again and again. Leo did not need to pick it up to recognize it. He had placed that rosary into Tagle's hand at their farewell. He stepped closer, the guard's breath audible behind him. It was locked, the young man whispered. I swear it. Leo extended his hand. The beads were cool against his palm, no trace of heat, no lingering glow. And yet holding them, he felt the strange, immediate intimacy of touching a thing that should not be where it was. Who else has been in this corridor since last night? Leo asked without turning. No one without being seen, Petro answered quietly. I checked the duty logs before waking you. There is no entry for this chapel. The key has not left the guard station. Leo closed his fist around the rosary, feeling each bead press into his skin. Then either the logs lie, he said, or our understanding of doors does. He did not smile. The attempt at humor was thin, if it was an attempt at all. He lifted the rosary slightly, letting it dangle. Louis, he thought, not daring to say the name aloud with so many eyes on him, are you sending this back to me, or is something sending you back to me through it? By midday, word of an incident in the lower chapel had leaked, as such things inevitably did. Details blurred in the retelling. Some said a guard had seen a statue move. Others whispered of a figure in white walking through the corridor without casting a shadow. But the consistent thread, passed from mouth to ear with growing urgency, was simple: something was happening. The second blow fell that afternoon. Leo returned to his study after a meeting with the Secretariat to find Petro standing rigidly inside the doorway, his face ashen. Your Holiness, he said, you told me to inform you immediately if anything else. He gestured helplessly at the desk. Leo followed his hand. Another envelope lay there. It had not been there when he left. No one had entered with him. The paper was the same heavy stock. The seal, once more, bore the broken circle, this time stamped cleanly, as if the signum fractum had stepped forward from suggestion to declaration. Who brought this? Leo asked, though he already suspected the answer. No one I have seen, Petro said. I did not leave the door from the time you went to the meeting until now. I heard nothing. Leo approached the desk as one might approach an unexploded device. He did not sit. He stood and broke the seal with one firm motion. The wax offered no resistance. Inside was a single sheet. No formal greeting, no signature, only a sentence written in the same familiar script that had filled the journal with impossible dates. The 7th hour approaches. The ink was still fresh. Leo read the line twice, then a third time, as if repetition might unlock it. "The 7th hour of what?" Petro whispered. Leo did not answer. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it beneath the journal, as though keeping all inexplicable things together might make them less dangerous. The Vatican did not take long to enter crisis. By evening, a discreet but unmistakable summons had circulated among the senior cardinals. They gathered in a vaulted meeting room, crimson sleeves brushing against polished wood, eyes sharp with concern. Some had already heard rumors of the journal. Others of the chapel. All of them now knew about the second letter. "Holy Father," one said, his voice carefully controlled, "with respect, this pattern cannot be ignored." A resigned cardinal, a broken seal of ancient omen, objects appearing where they should not be. He paused, weighing his next word. And now phrases that sound disturbingly like prophecy. Another cardinal, older, his hands knotted with arthritis, shook his head. "Or like manipulation," he said. "We do not know that these are from Tagle at all. There are forces who would rejoice to see us chase phantoms." "Tagle is no manipulator," someone else snapped. "He may be misguided, but he is not cruel." "Misguided," a third repeated. "If these events are tied to him, then he is a prophet or a danger. There is no comfortable middle." Voices rose, then fell, each man struggling to bring his fear into the safety of reason. Leo listened, his hands folded, his face unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Louis Tagle," he said, using the familiar name deliberately, "has given his life in obedience. Whatever is happening now, I will not begin by assuming fraud." "Then you think he is a prophet?" one pressed. "I think," Leo answered slowly, "that obedience has drawn him into something we do not yet understand. And that our first task is not to condemn what we do not understand." "Holy Father," the arthritic cardinal said, "if you do not define this, others will. The faithful will hear whispers of apparitions and glowing objects. They will look to you for clarity." Leo met his gaze. "And what clarity shall I give?" he asked quietly. "That I am being sent letters no courier brings? That I hear a voice in an empty chapel? That a rosary I placed in a friend's hand has returned to my altar without passing through any hand at all? Shall I pretend these things have not happened?" The room was silent. "I will not call Louis a rebel," Leo said at last. "Nor will I crown him a prophet. Not yet. I will say only this: something is being revealed. Truth does not divide, it reveals. That sentence has been following me for 2 days. Until I know what is being revealed, I will not allow us to make an enemy of a man whose only crime has been loving the Church too much for his own strength." It was not the decisive condemnation some had hoped for, nor the ecstatic endorsement others secretly feared. It was worse. It was uncertainty, spoken aloud. Night came with a weight that pressed against the windows. Leo found himself drawn not to his study, not to his chapel, but to the apostolic library, a place where knowledge was stacked in quiet surrender, row upon row of human attempts to capture truth between covers. The librarian had left hours earlier. The great room was lit sparsely, pools of lamplight punctuating stretches of shadow. Dust motes drifted in the beams like a slow, silent snowfall. Leo walked between towering shelves, his fingertips brushing leather bindings without reading the titles. The smell of paper and age wrapped around him like a familiar cloak. At the center of the library, a long table stood beneath a chandelier whose candles burned low. Someone had left a single lamp lit at one end, its glow gathered around an open space as if waiting for a reader. He saw the figure before he heard any sound. A cloaked shape knelt at the far end of the table, head bowed, hands folded around something that caught the lamplight in small glints. A rosary. Leo's heart lurched. "Louis," he said, the name escaping in barely more than a breath. The figure did not move. The hood concealed the face, the shoulders still and narrow, the posture unmistakably prayerful. He took a step closer. "Louis," he repeated, louder now, hope and fear woven tightly through the syllables. The rosary lifted slightly, as if in answer, or as if the light itself had shifted, casting a brief pattern of beads and cross along the wood. Then the flame of the lamp flickered. For a second, the room plunged toward darkness. When the light steadied again, the space at the end of the table was empty. No figure. No robe. No rosary. Only the quiet expanse of polished wood. Leo stood rooted to the floor, the echo of his own question hanging in the air. He was no longer sure which frightened him more, that these shadows were tricks of exhaustion and grief, or that they were not tricks at all. Either way, the message was the same. Something had stepped into the edges of his world, into chapels and studies and now the library itself, and it was using the shapes and signs of Louis Tagle to speak. Whether it spoke of rebellion, revelation, or something else entirely, Leo did not yet know. But as he turned away, the prayer that rose unbidden in his heart was simple and terribly honest. "Lord, if this is your hand, do not let me mistake it for my friend's. And if it is my friend, do not let me mistake him for you." The words from the second letter had not moved since the day they arrived. The 7th hour approaches. They sat on Leo's desk like a small stone, heavier than their size allowed. He found his eyes returning to them at odd times, in the morning, between audiences, in the afternoon, as he signed documents that now felt strangely provisional. On the day everything changed, he glanced at the clock as he left his study. It was just before the 7th hour. The private chapel off his apartments was not grand. It had been chosen precisely for that reason. White walls. A modest altar. A crucifix carved by an anonymous hand. A row of candles in tall glass holders flickering before a simple tabernacle. Only a handful of people were present for the Mass. Petro, as always, kneeling near the front. A young priest visiting from the secretariat, serving quietly at the altar. 2 religious sisters who worked in the papal household. And at the very back, a Swiss guard standing at ease, his halberd set aside, hands folded. Leo vested in silence. The weight of the chasuble settled across his shoulders with a familiarity that should have comforted him. Today it felt like armor he was not entirely sure he had been given permission to wear. Spiritus Domini, he began, the familiar prayers unfolding. At first, it was like every other small Mass said in that chapel. The readings were spoken. The homily was brief, more for his own heart than for the few gathered. He spoke of Peter in the storm, of Christ walking on water, of the difference between testing God and stepping out when summoned. As he moved to the altar for the consecration, the air in the chapel seemed to thicken. He noticed it in small things, the way the flame on the candles trembled without draught, the faint pressure in his ears as if he were climbing a mountain. He lifted the host. Hoc est enim corpus meum. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, thinner and somehow louder at once. He set the host down and reached for the chalice. That was when the wind came. There was no warning. No gradual stirring. One heartbeat, the chapel was still. The next, a violent gust tore through the room as if every window had been thrown open at once. The sound was like a living thing, rushing, roaring, filling every corner of the small space. The flames on the candles leapt, bent, and went out in rapid succession, glass chimneys rattling against their stands. Petro gasped. One of the sisters cried out. The guard at the back swore under his breath before catching himself. Every candle died. Every candle but one. Leo's hand tightened on the chalice to keep it from slipping. The host on the paten wavered but did not move. The wind pressed against his vestments, then receded as suddenly as it had arrived. Silence slammed back into the chapel. Only a single flame remained, one thin, stubborn tongue of fire near the center of the altar rail, flickering beside a small dish of votive candles that had all gone dark. The remaining flame steadied, and in it something took shape. At first it was only an impression, like a shadow caught at the edge of vision. Then, as every eye in the chapel fixed on that small light, the suggestion became an outline. A man kneeling. Shoulders bowed. Head inclined. Hands folded over a rosary. No face, no color, only the unmistakable silhouette burned into the heart of the flame. Someone behind Leo dropped to his knees. Another began to whisper the Hail Mary over and over, the words tumbling out in disbelief. Louis, Leo breathed. He did not mean to speak the name, but it left his mouth anyway, drawn out of him as surely as breath itself. The outline did not move. It did not lift its head or raise its hands. It merely knelt, as if in perpetual adoration, held inside the fragile architecture of light. Then, as quickly as it had formed, it dissolved. The flame shuddered, stretched, and snapped back into ordinary fire. The sound of breathing filled the chapel, harsh, uneven, as if everyone had been underwater and surfaced at the same time. Leo realized his hands were shaking. Very carefully, he finished the consecration. He spoke the remaining prayers with a steadiness that surprised him. When he held up the chalice, he felt as though he were doing it not only for those in the room, but for someone beyond it. Communion was received in near silence. No one seemed to know what words would be appropriate afterward, and so they chose none at all. When the last of the faithful had left, Leo remained kneeling before the altar. The single candle still burned, no different now from its extinguished companions when relit. No trace of the kneeling figure remained. Your journey, Leo whispered into the quiet, has left the realm of decisions and entered the realm of, what? Vision? Sign? Madness? He closed his eyes. Or grace? The rosary that had returned from the locked chapel lay in his pocket, the beads pressing against his palm like a heartbeat. For the first time since the whole strange chain of events had begun, he allowed himself to name the possibility that had been lurking at the edges of his mind. Louis Tagle's obedience had carried him beyond Leo's reach. And yet, somehow, it had not carried him away. Word of the chapel spread, though no official statement was made. The young priest told only his confessor. The sisters told no one, but their eyes shone wet through the day, and that was its own kind of testimony. The guard lasted 3 hours before pulling a colleague aside and swearing him to secrecy, which guaranteed the story would span 3 continents by nightfall. The Vatican grew restless. So did the sky. By late afternoon, heavy clouds had rolled in from the west, stacking themselves over Rome in layers of charcoal and bruised purple. The air felt charged, every surface holding a faint, electric tension. Pilgrims filled St. Peter's Square despite the threat of rain. Some had come because it was their scheduled day. Others because rumors of a sign in one of the papal chapels had leaked just enough to pull hearts toward the basilica like a tide. Umbrellas bloomed as the first drops fell. People shifted, considering retreat, then chose instead to huddle together, ponchos rustling, plastic crackling, a congregation of the stubbornly hopeful. From a window above, Leo watched the storm gather. Thunder rolled, low and distant at first, then closer. Lightning flashed along the horizon, jagged lines cutting through the clouds. "Holy Father," Petro said carefully behind him, "we can cancel the appearance. No one would blame you." "The weather." Leo raised a hand. "The weather," he said, "has been defying us for days. I do not think staying inside will tame it." He turned away from the window. "Prepare the balcony," he said. "I will go out." Petro hesitated. "Without a canopy?" he asked. "Without anything," Leo replied. "If God is going to speak through storms now, it would be discourteous to answer from behind glass." Minutes later, the great doors to the central balcony opened. Rain rushed in first, cool and insistent, dotting the marble floor. Wind tugged at his white cassock, plastering it briefly against his legs before letting go. The square below erupted in movement. Umbrellas tilted upward. Phones were raised. Some people simply stared, their faces turned toward him like flowers toward the sun, despite the water streaming down. Leo stepped forward. He wore no mitre, no stole. Only the simple white of his office, and now, within seconds, he wore the storm as well. Raindrops soaked his hair, slid down his cheeks, darkened the fabric over his shoulders. Lightning cracked, closer now, a brilliant vein across the sky. Thunder followed almost immediately, a sharp, rolling crash that seemed to vibrate in his ribs. Behind him, someone opened an umbrella on instinct, moving to shield him. He shook his head. "Put it away," he said, not unkindly. Faith was never meant to stay dry. He did not realize he had raised his voice until he heard the words bounce back from stone and water. The phrase carried out over the square, caught in the microphones, translated instantly into a dozen tongues on the lips of reporters and pilgrims alike. Faith was never meant to stay dry. Somewhere in the crowd, someone laughed through tears. Others simply stood there, rain dripping from their noses and chins, as if those words had explained, in one sentence, why they had not fled. Leo lifted his hands, not in blessing yet, but in something closer to surrender. "Signore," he prayed silently, "if you are in this, then show yourself. And if I am merely a man losing his footing, catch me before I drag others with me." The sky answered. Not with another crack of lightning, but with a tearing apart. The clouds above the basilica split along a line he could not have drawn if he tried. The opening widened, a vast, uneven corridor of light between two towering walls of grey. From that gap, a band of colour unfurled. It began as a faint wash, barely visible against the brightness, then deepened into a clear arc, a rainbow not cast low across distant hills, but hanging directly above the Vatican itself. It stretched outward, its far end disappearing beyond the rooftops, then reappearing, so it seemed, from the direction of the Tiber, as if river and dome were joined by the same luminous bow. A sound rose from the square. Not a cheer. Something more complex, a collective gasp, a sob, a ragged chorus of prayers breaking free of throats all at once. People dropped to their knees in the puddles. Some held up rosaries that caught the wet light. Others simply raised empty hands, fingers spread, as if hoping to catch whatever was being poured out of the split sky. On the steps of the basilica, bishops and monsignors who had come prepared with carefully worded remarks stood frozen. One older prelate, known for his caution, lifted trembling hands to his face and wept openly. Rain continued to fall, but the space beneath the arch seemed altered. Brighter. Softer. As if the storm itself had decided to kneel. Leo felt water running down his temples, into his collar, along his spine. He did not move to wipe it away. The rosary in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, each bead a small, insistent weight. He thought of the kneeling silhouette in the candle flame. Of the journal that wrote ahead of its author's footsteps. Of the broken circle on the letters, now mirrored in the unbroken, radiant curve above his head. "This is not about you, Leo," a memory whispered in his mind, a younger Louis, arguing with him in a quieter room, eyes fierce with conviction. "We are not the point. We are only the bridge." The word struck him like a physical touch. Bridge. The rainbow arched like one between heaven and earth, between the dome and the river. Between his fear and whatever waited on the other side of it. He understood, in that moment, something he had resisted naming. Louis was not being drawn away from him as punishment. He was being drawn ahead of him as guide. Every sign, every impossible object, every whispered phrase had been less about proving Tagle's holiness and more about loosening Leo's grasp on the things he could no longer hold. Surrender was not the loss of his friend. Surrender was trusting that their separation was in service to a larger obedience neither of them fully saw. He lifted his hands then, finally, in blessing. Water streamed from his fingertips as he traced the sign of the cross over a square full of soaked, shining faces. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit," he said, voice carrying clear over rain and thunder. As he spoke, the rainbow brightened for a heartbeat, as if answering. Later, men would argue about meteorology and coincidence. Later, statements would be drafted, carefully avoiding the word miracle. But in that moment, under that bow of color, with the weight of a returned rosary in his pocket and the memory of a kneeling light still fresh in his eyes, Leo knew. Whatever Louis Tagle had stepped into, it was no longer only human. And whatever Leo would have to let go of in the days to come, he would not be letting go into emptiness, but into the same unseen hands that now shaped storms into bridges. The rainbow did not last. Storms never do. By evening, the sky over Rome had returned to a muted grey, streaked with the last traces of light. The news networks replayed the images of the arching colors over St. Peter's in endless loops. Commentators argued. Meteorologists explained. Skeptics smirked. Pilgrims cried in hotel rooms, clutching damp rosaries, trying to find words for what they had felt. Inside the apostolic palace, Leo sat in his study, his cassock still faintly damp at the collar, the rosary heavy in his pocket. The miracle in the chapel. The bow over the basilica and the river. The phrase that had left his own mouth as if borrowed from somewhere beyond him, faith was never meant to stay dry. He did not know what the world would call it. He was not sure what he called it himself. But he knew this, whatever Lewis had stepped into, it was now shaping the weather of his soul. On his desk, the first two letters lay side by side. The seventh hour approaches. And beneath it, the resignation that had begun everything. He looked at them, then at the clock. It was almost the hour of vespers when Petro knocked softly and entered without waiting for an answer. His expression was careful, the way a man looks when carrying something that might be either a gift or a wound. "Holy Father," he said, "another letter has arrived." Leo's stomach tightened. "How?" he asked quietly. "And from whom?" Petro did not answer at once. Instead, he stepped forward and placed the envelope on the blotter. "It was on your pillow," he said. "I changed the linens myself this afternoon. It was not there then. I returned just now to turn down the bed, and it was waiting." Leo studied the envelope. The paper was the same, heavy, slightly textured. The seal was the same broken circle he had come to dread and expect, pressed cleanly into wax. But something within it seemed different, a softness, a finality he could not explain. He broke it open. A faint scent rose from within. Not incense, not old paper. Something green and clean, like alpine air carried on cloth. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, and pressed between its halves, a flower. It was small, pale blue with a yellow center, flattened but still delicate. Its petals had the fragile translucence of something that had surrendered itself to time without losing its shape. Leo knew it by sight. "Forget-me-not," he murmured. "A mountain flower. More common in the north than in Rome." He had seen them once on a pilgrimage years before his election, growing in sparse clusters along a rocky path that led toward snow. His heart began to pound. He unfolded the paper fully. There, in the same steady, familiar script, a sentence waited. "The journey is done. The silence is full. The light has reached me." That was all. No signature. No explanation. No description of where here was, or what light meant, or how silence could be anything but empty. Yet as he read the line again, Leo felt something shift in him, the way a landscape changes when clouds move and a hidden shape reveals itself underneath. "The journey is done," he repeated softly. He had assumed Lewis's pilgrimage was physical, northward, perhaps, toward some monastery or shrine in the Alps. But here, the word felt different. Not a distance measured in kilometers, but in surrender. The silence is full. He thought of his study, of the chapel, of the library. All the places where Lewis's absence had howled like loss, and where, lately, that same absence had seemed to hum with a presence no eye could pinpoint. "The light has reached me." It did not say "I have reached the light." It said "the light has reached me." Leo exhaled, the breath leaving him in a slow, uneven stream. Lewis, he said to the empty room, "Wherever you are, you have arrived." Peace moved through him first, quiet and deep, lapping at the raw edges of his grief like a tide around broken stone. Then the unbearable part came. If Lewis's journey was truly complete, if he had reached, or been reached by, whatever this light was, then the distance between them was no longer measured in offices or continents. It was measured in mortality. Lewis had gone somewhere Leo could not yet follow. Not yet. But soon. He did not announce the letter. There were already too many facts he could not explain. Too many whispers in corridors, too many people trying to weigh the spiritual on the scales of politics. Instead, Leo placed the pressed flower carefully between 2 pages of Tagle's journal, as if returning it to its proper context. The words on the entry beneath described a mountain trail, a chapel half carved into rock, a sense of being watched by something kinder than judgment. He closed the book gently. If your journey is done, he thought, then I must decide what mine is for. The answer did not present itself. It came, instead, as a pull. "Assisi," he said aloud. Petro, who had been waiting quietly near the door, looked up in surprise. "Holy Father." "I must go to Francis," Leo said simply. "If I am to learn how to let go, I should ask a man who gave up everything." The trip was arranged quietly, with as little ceremony as possible. A helicopter would have been faster, but Leo chose the car. He wanted the distance, the hours of gradual transition from Rome's stone to Umbria's hills, from Vatican walls to olive groves and low stone farmhouses. The road unwound beneath them in long grey ribbons. Vineyards and fields rolled past the windows. The sky above was clear now, washed clean by the storm, the kind of blue that made him think of stained glass without glass. Petro rode in the front, speaking softly into a phone, coordinating security. Leo sat in the back alone, the rosary in his hand, the pressed flower and Tagle's letter folded in the pocket over his heart. He watched the landscape and thought of all the journeys Lewis had taken, official visits, quiet retreats, moments of escape when the pressure of Rome had been too much. He wondered where exactly the flower had been picked. Whether Lewis had knelt in snow to pluck it or simply found it placed on a stone as he passed. He wondered who had carried the letter from that unnamed place to his pillow. By the time they entered Assisi, the sun had begun its descent. The town clung to the hillside as it always had, its stones warmed by centuries of prayer and pilgrimage. The Basilica of St. Francis rose above it, lead and luminous, the lower church anchored in the earth, the upper reaching for the sky. Leo stepped out of the car and felt immediately smaller. It was a relief. Inside the lower basilica, the air was cool and thick with the smell of stone and incense. Frescoes watched from the walls, stories painted in color and dust, depicting a man who had renounced the wealth of his family to marry Lady Poverty. Leo approached the tomb slowly. It was simple. No gilding, no elaborate sculpture. Just rough stone and the quiet hum of countless whispered prayers. He knelt. The movement was slower than it once would have been. His joints protested in small, familiar ways. The floor was hard beneath his knees, but the discomfort felt appropriate. He placed both hands on the edge of the stone. "Francis," he said quietly, "you gave up everything so your heart would be free. I have spent my life holding everything so others would not be crushed." His voice did not echo. It barely rose above a murmur. I do not know how to finish as you did, he continued. I do not know how to lay this down without dropping it on someone else. He paused, searching for the words that had been forming at the edges of his thoughts since the storm over Rome. Teach me to lead by letting go, he prayed. Not abandoning. Not fleeing. Just releasing what is no longer mine to hold. Silence answered. Not empty silence. The basilica's peculiar, living stillness, the gathered quiet of centuries of pilgrims, of their griefs and hopes and small triumphs laid down and left here like invisible flowers. He stayed on his knees until his legs had gone numb and the ache in his back became insistent. When he finally rose, he felt no blinding revelation, no sudden clarity. What he felt was a slight lessening of resistance inside himself. As if, somewhere in the deep soil of his will, a fist had loosened one finger. They returned to Rome that same evening. The city glowed in pockets, the warm spill of light from trattorias, the steady lamps along the Tiber, the hushed brilliance of the basilica's facade. By the time Leo reached his apartments, fatigue pressed against his skull like a band of iron. Petro followed him in, concern etched plainly on his face. Holy Father, he began, you have done too much these days. The storm, the mass, the travel, your physicians would insist you rest. At least tonight. No more meetings. No more chapels. The last word held a pleading note. Leo smiled faintly. That is the most UN Catholic sentence you have ever said to me, Petro, he replied. No more chapels. Petro did not smile. I am serious, he said. Your hands trembled at Vespers. I saw it. Your color is poor. Please. Rest. For the Church's sake if not for your own. Leo hesitated. There was wisdom in the request. There always was in Petro's worries, the man's instincts for preservation, of schedules, of structures, of Leo himself, were rarely wrong. But there was another pull tonight. Not to his desk. Not even to the journal or the letters. To the chapel. I will rest, Leo said gently. After I pray. Holiness. After I pray, Leo repeated, not sharply, but with a firmness that closed the discussion. Petro bowed his head, defeated, and stepped back. If you need anything, he said, anything at all, ring. Or call. Or shout. I will be just outside. Leo touched his arm briefly in gratitude and left the study. The corridor to the private chapel felt longer than usual. His steps were slower, his breath slightly shorter. Age, he thought. Nothing more. The day had simply been long. He reached the door and paused, fingers resting on the handle. Louis, he thought, if your journey is done, then mine is nearing its last turn. He opened the door. The chapel greeted him with a now familiar arrangement of light and shadow. A single lamp near the tabernacle. The white cloth on the altar. The candles unlit. He did not bother with switches or matches. He moved to the front pew and sat instead of kneeling. The concession felt like honesty, not weakness. From his pocket, he drew the rosary. The onyx beads glinted faintly. The silver crucifix swung gently at the end of the loop, catching the red of the sanctuary lamp in its dull metal. He closed his hand around it until the edges of the cross pressed into his palm. "Louis," he whispered into the quiet, "guide me." The words were nothing like the grand prayers he had spoken from balconies and pulpits. They were small, almost childish, but they carried more of his heart than any carefully composed collect. He leaned back against the wooden pew, eyes half closed. The fatigue he had been holding at bay all day seeped into him fully now, seeping into his bones, his muscles, the lines of his face. His breathing slowed. He did not intend to sleep. He intended only to rest his eyes for a moment. The chapel dissolved. Not in the way rooms dissolve when one drifts into ordinary dreams, but in a different way, like a veil being drawn aside. Leo felt himself standing, though he knew he had not moved. The bench beneath him was gone. The scent of wax and incense replaced by air that was sharp and thin, filling his lungs with a clean, cold ache. He opened his eyes. He stood on a mountainside. The sky above him was a dark, lucid blue, freckled with stars so clear and close they seemed within reach. Snow lay in patches along the ground, stubborn remnants clinging to stone. The air smelled of ice and distant pine. Before him, a ridge rose, its summit outlined by the faint glow of moonlight on rock. And there, on a flat stretch of ground not far away, a figure knelt. Leo knew him even before he saw his face. The posture, the slope of the shoulders, the way the hands cradled the beads. Louis. Cardinal Tagle wore no red now. He was dressed in simple dark clothing, a heavy cloak around his shoulders, its edges dusted with snow. His head was bowed, his breath visible in small, steady clouds. In his hands, a rosary moved bead by bead, the same rhythm Leo felt in his own clenched fist. "Louis," Leo said, but his voice did not seem to carry. The figure lifted his head slightly, as if hearing something on the edge of perception. He did not turn. He did not look directly at Leo. But his face was visible in profile, peaceful, lined, illuminated by a light that did not seem to come from any visible source. Behind him, along the curve of the ridge, a symbol formed in the air. At first, Leo thought it was the moon. Then he realized it was a circle of light, complete, unbroken. Its glow was soft but sure, outlining the shape of the mountain and the man in front of it with a kind of quiet authority. The broken seal. Whole. Where once there had been a fracture, an interruption, there was now continuity. No split in the ring. No weak point. Just a single, perfect line. The journey is done, Leo thought, remembering the letter. The silence is full. The light has reached me. He understood now. Louis's silence was not absence. It was completion. The broken circle had been their time together, beautiful, necessary, but incomplete. His resignation, the signs, the storm, the letters, all had been the opening through which something else could flow. Now, the circle was closed. Louis's obedience had not been an act of departure from God or from Leo. It had been the final curve in a path that brought him entirely into whatever this light was. Leo felt a warmth in his chest, spreading outward, not erasing sorrow but dignifying it, turning it into something like gratitude. Obedience, he realized, was never about staying. The thought did not come in words so much as in knowing, rising through him like water from a deep spring. Obedience is surrender. Staying could be disobedience if it meant clinging to a role God was asking you to release. Leaving could be obedience if it meant trusting that the work was no longer yours. And now, perhaps, even living could become disobedience if God was gently, unmistakably calling you home. Lewis's lips moved. Leo could not hear the prayer, but he knew its direction. It was for him. For Leo. For the church. For the fragile, staggering body of believers stumbling forward on roads neither of them would walk much longer. The circle of light behind Lewis pulsed once, like a heartbeat. Then the mountain air thinned. The stars blurred. The snow and rock and kneeling figure dissolved into dark. Leo drew in a sharp breath. He was back in the chapel. The wooden pew under him. The sanctuary lamp flickering steadily. The rosary biting into his palm. His heart hammered, not with fear, but with a strange, fierce tenderness. Petro's voice came faintly from the corridor. "Holy Father? Are you well? May I come in?" Leo did not answer at once. He opened his hand and looked at the beads. The rosary lay there, unchanged. Simple. Earthly. And yet it felt now like a line tethered between him and that mountainside, between his slowing heart and the completed circle of light. Soon, he thought, not as a wish, but as acknowledgement. Soon. "Holy Father." Petro called again, more urgently. "I am here, Petro," Leo answered finally, raising his voice just enough. "I am resting." There was a pause, then the soft scrape of the secretary's shoes as he moved away, reassured for the moment. Leo leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, the rosary hanging between his hands. "Lewis," he whispered, with no hesitation now, "you have finished what was asked of you." He closed his eyes. "Help me finish what is asked of me." The peace that settled over him then did not erase his weariness. It did not promise an easy road. It did not offer survival. It offered something better. Readiness. In the quiet of his private chapel, with a returned rosary in his hand and the memory of an unbroken circle burning in his mind, Pope Leo XIV finally stopped arguing with the shape of his own ending. He did not know how many days remained. But he knew, now, what they were for. Not for clinging. For surrender. The night did not end so much as thin. Darkness in the apostolic palace softened into a kind of grey expectancy. The city beyond the walls lay in that fragile hour when even Rome seems unsure whether it still belongs to the night or is ready to admit the day. In his private chapel, Leo knelt. He had come there before dawn, as he always did now, pulled more by gratitude than by duty. The wooden pew pressed into his knees. His back ached in the familiar places. His breathing was a little shallower than it once had been, but still steady. Before him, a single candle burned low. Its flame was small, no longer eager, but persistent, a final, faithful witness keeping watch before the tabernacle. Wax had pooled around its base, hardening in ripples like the memory of motion. In his hands, Leo held the onyx rosary. The bead slid slowly beneath his fingers, each one a step he no longer needed to measure, each prayer less request now than thanks. "Thank you," he murmured, barely moving his lips. For Lewis. For the signs. For the surrender I fought and you waited for. Beyond the narrow window, dawn began to tug at the horizon. A faint wash of light brushed the edge of the sky, so subtle it could have been imagined. The flame on the candle fluttered once. Leo exhaled. "If it is time," he whispered, "let it be facing you. And if you are kind." He hesitated, the last word catching in his throat. "Let it be with him." The chapel dissolved. Not in fragments, not like a room melting into dream, but in a single, gentle unmaking, as if someone had lifted a veil between scenes. Leo felt no jolt, no fall. He was simply elsewhere. He stood on the bank of the Tiber. The river flowed slow and dark before him, its surface touched by the first shy strokes of dawn. Mist curled low along the water, soft and luminous, blurring edges into something almost tender. In his hand, the rosary remained, onyx beads cool against his skin. Across the river, a figure waited. Louis. Tagle stood on the opposite bank, clothed in white that did not glare, but glowed, like cloth woven from light itself. His face was unlined by worry, but not emptied of history. It carried every year Leo remembered, now suffused with a radiance that seemed to come from within and behind him at once. He was smiling. Behind him, arching from his shore to Leo's, stretched a bridge. It was not made of stone or metal. It was made of light, a golden curve rising gracefully over the water, each span shimmering softly, as if composed of thousands of held prayers finally given form. Leo's breath caught. "Louis," he said. The name left his mouth like a blessing and a farewell and a greeting all at once. Across the river, Tagle raised his hand. Not in command. Not in summoning. In blessing. The gesture was small and utterly sure, the way he had once blessed villagers in forgotten parishes, young priests before their first Mass, Leo himself on nights when the burdens had pressed too hard. Peace moved through Leo then, not the fragile peace he had negotiated with himself so many times, but something wholly other. It rolled through him like a slow, warm tide, filling every hollow, washing away every last, clinging fear. His knees buckled. He did not fall. He found himself kneeling again, as he had been in the chapel, only now the stone beneath him felt both foreign and utterly right. His fingers loosened. The rosary slipped from his hand. It fell in slow motion, each bead momentarily catching the nascent light, then came to rest on the ground. He did not reach for it. He no longer needed a line to the other side. The bridge stood before him. His gaze stayed fixed on Louis, on the smile, the lifted hand, the silent invitation carried in that unbroken golden arc. He let out a breath that felt, unmistakably, like his last. And then there was only light. Petro found him minutes later. The chapel door stood ajar. The candle on the altar flickered weakly, its wick almost spent. Leo knelt in the front pew, body bowed slightly forward, hands resting open on his thighs, empty. His face was turned toward the tabernacle. His expression was not one of strain. It was one of arrival. Petro fell to his knees before he reached him. "Holy Father," he whispered, voice breaking, though somewhere deep inside he already knew there would be no answer. "Leo!" He wept there in the small chapel, the last sigh of the candle echoing his own shuddering breath as the flame gave one final tremor and went out. Outside, Rome stirred. Then the bells began. First one, then another, then all at once, a great, rolling chorus of sound poured over rooftops and across the river, waking the city to the news it had not yet heard with its ears but was already learning in its bones. The Pope was gone. Pilgrims drifted, as they always did, toward the Tiber. They gathered along its banks, drawn by instinct and rumor and something less definable, some whisper that whatever had happened within walls had also, somehow, touched the water that held the city's reflection. The sun climbed. At a particular moment no one later could quite agree on, a single beam of light broke through the soft haze of morning. It struck the dome of St. Peter's first, igniting its curve in sudden brilliance. Then, almost impossibly, it stretched, reaching across the air until its other end touched the far bank of the river, the place where, in Leo's vision, Louis had stood. The line between them glowed. Someone gasped. "Guard 8, a woman whispered. "Look! Illinois Ponte?" "The bridge," another repeated, voice trembling. "Illinois Ponte Eterno." The name spread along the river like the light itself. The eternal bridge. Not of stone. Not of policy. Not of power. Of grace. Later, theologians would debate. Officials would craft careful language. Statements would be issued that said enough to comfort but not enough to commit. But the pilgrims who had been there that morning would remember something simpler. That, for one breathless moment, the dome and the far bank had been joined by light. And somewhere in that joining, they were certain, two old friends had met again. In the days that followed, the wind along the Tiber seemed to carry a fragment of paper no one quite managed to catch. Some said it was only litter. Others swore they had seen writing on it, dark lines against pale fiber. If any had managed to read it, perhaps they would have seen a familiar hand, a final sentence, once carried in secret and now carried openly on the air. Faith never ends. It transforms. Before you go, subscribe, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and share your thoughts.